Right now, in secure vaults beneath the Chinese central bank, something is accumulating. Not dollars, not treasury bonds, gold, tons of it. And while Western media debates inflation and interest rates, China has been quietly executing a strategy that began 20 years ago. A strategy that could end the dollar's 70-year reign as the world's reserve currency. The strange part? They announced their intentions back in 2009. No one believed them. In 2001, China held approximately 600 tons of gold in its official reserves. Today, that number exceeds 2,300 tons, at least officially. But here's where the story gets interesting. Multiple analysts believe China's actual gold holdings could be double or triple what they report. Why hide it? Because revealing the full scale would destabilize markets before they're ready, before the trap is set. Every month, without fanfare, the People's Bank of China releases a small update. Another 20 tons added. Another 30. The purchases never stop. They've been continuous for nearly 19 consecutive months now. This isn't investment. This isn't hedging. This is preparation. Compare this to the United States. The US holds roughly 8,100 tons of gold, a figure that hasn't changed since the 1970s. America stopped accumulating. China never did. And when you look at the trajectory, something becomes clear. They're not just buying gold to diversify. They're building a foundation for something else entirely. The gold itself comes from everywhere. African mines, Russian refineries, domestic production that outpaces every nation on Earth. China produces roughly 370 tons of gold annually from its own mines, and unlike most countries, none of it ever leaves. Every ounce mined on Chinese soil stays in Chinese vaults. Add to that the imports, purchases through Hong Kong, acquisitions through state-owned enterprises operating in foreign territories, and you begin to see the scale of the operation. In August 2023, something shifted. The BRICS summit in Johannesburg wasn't just another diplomatic gathering. Behind closed doors, discussions intensified around a shared currency mechanism. Not a single currency like the euro, something more flexible, a settlement system backed by commodities, gold being the primary anchor. This is where things quietly went wrong for the dollar system. For decades, the dollar's dominance rested on one simple fact. If you wanted to buy oil, you needed dollars. If you wanted to trade internationally, you needed dollars. The entire global economy was structured around this requirement. But BRICS nations, collectively representing 45% of the world's population and increasingly its economic output, began asking a different question. What if we didn't? The proposal on the table isn't to replace the dollar overnight. It's more subtle than that. Create a parallel system. Let countries trade in local currencies with imbalances settled through a commodity-backed unit, gold, oil, rare earth elements, real assets instead of debt-backed paper. And who holds leverage in rare earth elements? China controls 90% of the world's processing capacity. Not mining, processing. The critical refinement that turns raw ore into the materials that power every smartphone, every electric vehicle, every wind turbine, every weapon system. Most people never notice this part. While America outsourced manufacturing to chase financial sector profits, China secured the supply chains for the next century. They don't just make things. They control the inputs required for everyone else to make things. And now they're proposing a trading system where these tangible resources back the medium of exchange. The dollar's strength was never just economic. It was structural. It was enforced. Countries held dollars because they had no choice. But structural power has a weakness. It assumes compliance. It assumes no one builds an alternative. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced Iraq would sell oil in euros instead of dollars. 18 months later, the US invaded. In 2011, Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency for oil trade. Within months, NATO forces supported his removal. The pattern was clear. Challenge the dollar's primacy, face consequences. But China isn't Iraq. China isn't Libya. China is the world's second largest economy, largest trading partner to over 120 countries, and a nuclear power with a military that rivals America's. You cannot invade China. You cannot regime change China, which means If China builds an alternative system and convinces enough partners to join, there's no enforcement mechanism to stop it. This is the mistake no one talks about. The dollar's dominance was always temporary. Every reserve currency in history eventually failed. The Spanish real, the Dutch guilder, the British pound. Each one seemed permanent until suddenly it wasn't. The average lifespan of a reserve currency is roughly 94 years. The dollar has held that position since 1944. We're approaching 80 years. Let's talk about what actually gives China leverage beyond gold. In the remote mountains of Inner Mongolia, Jiangxi, and Sichuan provinces, China processes 90% of the rare earth elements that modern civilization depends on. Neodymium for electric motors, dysprosium for wind turbines, europium for LED screens, terbium for semiconductors. These aren't luxury goods. These are the fundamental building blocks of 21st century technology. And China didn't acquire this dominance through natural resource advantage. Other countries have rare earth deposits. Australia, the United States, Canada, all have significant reserves. But rare earth processing is environmentally catastrophic, incredibly expensive, and takes decades to scale. So the West let China do it, outsource the dirty work, and now finds itself completely dependent. In 2010, China gave the world a preview of this leverage. During a territorial dispute with Japan, China halted rare earth exports to Japanese manufacturers. Within weeks, Japan's electronics industry faced critical shortages. The message was clear. China doesn't need to fire missiles to cripple an advanced economy. They just need to turn off the spigot. Now imagine that leverage applied to currency systems. A BRICS settlement currency partially backed by rare earth elements. If you want access to the materials that make your economy function, you trade through the system. You hold the currency. You accept the terms. It's the dollar system in reverse, but backed by physical choke points instead of military bases. For 50 years, the petrodollar system kept the dollar indispensable. Saudi Arabia and OPEC nations agreed to sell oil exclusively in dollars. In exchange, America provided security guarantees, military equipment, and protection of their regimes. Oil consumers had to buy dollars first, creating artificial demand that kept the currency strong despite mounting debt. That arrangement is fracturing. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia and China completed their first oil transaction settled in yuan. A symbolic amount, but the precedent was set. Saudi Arabia has since opened discussions about joining BRICS, exploring deeper economic ties with nations that were supposed to be geopolitical rivals. The security guarantee America offered looks less valuable when the largest oil consumer, China, offers direct access to its market without demanding political alignment. The United Arab Emirates, another petrodollar pillar, has taken similar steps. Russia, already cut off from dollar systems through sanctions, now settles nearly 90% of its trade with China in yuan or rubles. Iran, Venezuela, and other sanctioned states have accelerated away from dollar dependency. The network effect that made the dollar essential is slowly unwinding. What happened next changed everything. When the US froze Russian central bank reserves in 2022, roughly $300 billion, a message rippled through every finance ministry on earth. Your reserves aren't really yours. If you fall out of political favor, that wealth disappears with a keystroke. China watched this carefully. So did India, Brazil, South Africa, and dozens of non-aligned nations. The weaponization of a dollar system created the urgency for an alternative. Gold doesn't require permission. It can't be sanctioned. It has no counterparty risk. When China proposes a settlement system with gold as a backing mechanism, they're offering something the dollar can't match anymore. Security. Not military security, financial security, independence. The mechanics would work like this. BRICS nations trade in local currencies. At the end of each quarter, trade imbalances settle through the transfer of gold or other agreed commodities. No need for dollar intermediation. No exposure to Federal Reserve policy decisions. No risk of asset freezes. China has been positioning for this exact scenario. Their gold reserves provide credibility. Their rare earth dominance provides enforcement. Their manufacturing base provides necessity. You want to trade with the world's largest consumer market, largest manufacturer, and increasingly largest creditor, you play by their rules. At this point, it looked normal. But this was actually the beginning of the collapse. The dollar doesn't hyperinflate and disappear overnight. It slowly becomes optional. First for countries under sanctions, then for nations seeking independence, then for pragmatic actors who realize the mathematics no longer favor dollar dependency. Each defection weakens the network effect. And once that network effect breaks, the advantages of holding dollars evaporate quickly. The United States government currently holds over $34 trillion in debt. The only way this debt remains manageable is through low interest rates and continued dollar demand. If global demand for dollars decreases, if fewer countries need to hold treasury bonds as reserves, interest rates must rise to attract buyers. Higher interest rates make the debt unsustainable. A fiscal crisis becomes inevitable. This is the trap. America can't afford to lose dollar dominance, but has no clear strategy to prevent it that doesn't involve actions that would accelerate the very thing they're trying to stop. Aggressive sanctions push more countries away. Military posturing against China risks conflict neither side can win. Economic isolation of BRICS nations only strengthens their alternative systems. Meanwhile, the structural advantages continue eroding. American manufacturing is a fraction of what it once was. The country runs persistent trade deficits, meaning more dollars flow out than come back. Education outcomes decline, while China produces 4 times as many STEM graduates annually. Infrastructure crumbles, while China builds at a pace that seems impossible until you visit and see it yourself. The currency is backed by the strength of the issuing nation, and the gap is narrowing. So when does this happen? When does the dollar lose its reserve status? The honest answer is no one knows. These transitions take decades, not months. The British pound remained a major reserve currency for 30 years after Britain lost its empire. Momentum carries you far even after the underlying conditions change. But momentum eventually stops. And there are indicators to watch. If Saudi Arabia formally joins BRICS and begins settling the majority of its oil sales in yuan or a BRICS currency, that's a critical threshold. If the European Union, seeking energy independence from both America and Russia, begins participating in alternative settlement systems, that's another. If more central banks reduce their treasury holdings while increasing gold reserves, that's a third. China doesn't need to announce a grand plan. They just need to keep doing what they're already doing. Accumulate gold, expand BRICS, deepen trade relationships settled in yuan, secure commodity supply chains. Each action by itself seems unremarkable. Together, they form a coherent strategy that's been unfolding for 2 decades. The question isn't whether China is trying to diminish dollar dominance. They've stated this goal explicitly in policy documents, academic papers, and diplomatic communications. The question is whether they'll succeed. And the uncomfortable reality is that success doesn't require defeating America. It just requires offering enough countries a credible alternative that the network effect sustains itself. In 1944, representatives from 44 countries met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and decided the dollar would replace the pound as the world's reserve currency. Not because of American military might, though that helped, because America held 75% of the world's monetary gold and ran a massive trade surplus. It made mathematical sense. Today, China runs the trade surplus. China accumulates the gold. China controls the supply chains. The mathematics are shifting, and mathematics don't care about tradition, about ideology, about who deserves to win. They just are. The dollar might survive this challenge. It's survived challenges before, but survival will require something more than momentum, more than past glory, more than the assumption that American dominance is permanent and natural. It will require adaptation, sacrifice, and strategic clarity that has been absent from American policy for decades. And the strange part is, most people still think this can't happen. That the dollar is too big to fail, too entrenched to replace, too backed by power to be challenged. That's what people thought about the pound in 1920. That's what they thought about the Dutch guilder in 1720. That's what they always think, until suddenly they don't. China's gold vaults keep filling. The BRICS alliance keeps expanding. The rare earth elements keep flowing through Chinese refineries. And somewhere in Beijing, in rooms where long-term strategy is measured in decades rather than election cycles. They're counting on one final assumption, that the West will keep underestimating them. That arrogance will do what sanctions never could. So far, they've been right.